Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you proudly today by SINC USA and Recorded Future. My name is Jason Senamore, the Chief Product Officer here at SINC, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a truly fantastic panel of security experts for a very candid discussion on risk versus compliance and how to level up your security strategy to the board. The board's role in the oversight of organizational risk is increasingly complicated by cybersecurity concerns. This session will essentially demonstrate how shifting from tick box exercises to maturity models grounded in security intelligence can help you achieve compliance with industry standards while strengthening your overall security posture. You'll also hear some real world perspectives on balancing risk appetite and strategy execution and how to elevate that to the board. As I mentioned, I am honored to be joined by a fantastic panel, which I will take the time to introduce to you now. First, we have Mr. Doug Frank, the Chief Information Security Officer at Hawaiian Airlines. Hello there, Doug.
Hello, good morning.
Hello there. Rob Hornbuckle, the Chief Information Security Officer at Allegiant. Hi there, Rob.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you for asking. Niloofar Howe, the Senior Operating Partner for Energy Impact Partners and member of the Board of Directors for Recorded Future. Hello there, Nilu.
Hi there, great to be here.
Delighted to have you. And last but by no means least, our moderator of proceedings today, Mr. Levi Gundert, the SVP of Global Intelligence at Recorded Future. Hi, Levi.
Thanks, Jason. Really looking forward to the conversation today.
Very much so. Well, without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Levi to conduct proceedings and start getting some insights from these panelists.
Excellent. So we have, I think, a great conversation that we're planning to have organically. We haven't had this conversation previously. This is all spontaneous. But I think we have some great experience here, both in terms of chief security officers and also the board representation. But it's also always better if we have input from those that are attending the webinar. So if you do have questions, just to reiterate what Jason said, would love to see the questions so that we can incorporate those questions as we go. So first off, I really want to start with an intro question to you, Nilu. What are the greatest challenges right now in communicating with the board, and where are the areas for improvement? How should CISOs, CSOs be thinking about the communication? I have a friend who shared a board presentation that he gave a couple of days ago, and it was about 12 slides. And one of the things that he said to me was, you know, the night before my presentation, my time slot got shrunk to 30 minutes. And then the morning of my presentation, it got cut down to 15 minutes. And there's obviously a lot of things that a board has to cover when they're meeting. So, you know, what should CSOs be focused on in terms of, you know, maximum effect when they are communicating with the board?
Sure, thank you. And it's really great to be here. And I have to tell you, it's a privilege to serve on the board of Recorded Future, which is an incredible company. You raise before we get to that question of CISO and board, we are living in unique times and we can't sort of lose sight of that. And every enterprise's risk profile has changed dramatically over the past 6 months. So I don't know that there's any board meeting today that represents a normal for board meetings. And you know, every board that I'm on right now, our pace of communications has fundamentally changed. I mean, we're having weekly, monthly board meetings when it was very normal cadence to just do quarterly board meetings with occasional check-in. So anything that's happened in the past week, I would say doesn't really represent a new normal of how we should be thinking about security presentations when it comes to the board. But stepping back for a second, the thing we have to keep in mind is that security became a board level issue and a CXO level issue only recently, past 5, 6, 7 years. And so fundamentally the language that we spoke as security professionals and the language that boards speak were not the same language, right? One is the language of technical issues and technical risk, and the other is the language of business risk, right? Security, as a security professional, we care about what happened, how it happened, the technical details of it so that we can figure out how to fix it. As a board member, we don't really care about the technical details. In fact, what we care about is what is the implication from a business perspective to the things I care about: tangible risk, intangible risk. So bridging that gap between what we do as security professionals and what boards have to think about on a regular basis is probably one of the biggest obstacles that we need to overcome. Now, I will say it's a journey for everyone. And if you think about it, board tenure is more than 5 or 6 years. So as this has risen to become a board issue, to a large extent, the CISO needs to educate the executive team and the board about the things that the board should care about, right? So just as each incident isn't really a board level issue, if the board is asking about each incident, then they're not really focused on the right things. So bridging that gap between security, technical security risk, and the implications from a business perspective and how it impacts the things that can be existential for a board member, I think is one of the challenges that we just have to overcome.
Yeah, those are great points in terms of the frequency and the cadence with which the board is meeting right now. And also, you know, that's always been the struggle from my point of view, is that, you know, cybersecurity is doing great things, but translating that into the language of business and risk, they may, to your point, may not understand technology or security, but they understand language of risk. Rob, going to you, you obviously have a lot of academic qualifications and professional experience, and you have a master's degree, but you also have an MBA. And I know, you know, that was important for you in terms of being able to have those conversations with the board. From your perspective, you know, what is the challenge right now in communicating with the board and, you know, with the best way to address it?
Well, business is its own language, and you need to understand it, you need to speak it, you need to translate it. And if you get stuck in a lot of the old ways that CISOs used to run things with the technical risk and the getting into the weeds and figuring out exactly how to fix those problems, and then expressing those problems in that technical nature to business-minded people, you're not really going to get anywhere with it, or you may get places and fits and starts. You just won't get the consistency that you're really looking for. It was important to me, determining that just by observation and going through it a few times, that I really needed to get that business knowledge, which is why I went back to get my MBA, even after having a master's in security already. Between the two, it gives you the credentials as well that when you get there, they're willing to listen to you. Before that, it's generally this opinion of, oh, that's the security guy. We'll ask them about security things. But if you can get to the table and you can speak the business language, and then while you're there, you can contribute on actual business items that are going on, because you're an officer of the company. Yes, your primary responsibility is security, but as an officer of the company, you're at the table. You can bounce business ideas off of people. You can be a sounding board for other people's business ideas. And the more you contribute from a business standpoint, the more trust you'll build within that organization. Now, this is more at the C-suite level than it is necessarily the board level. The biggest problem you end up with at the board level is you just don't get enough face time to develop those kinds of business relationships. So I end up getting stuck a lot in the same situations you were explaining before. So yes, the weekly cadence isn't normal, but it is fairly normal to be narrowed down to very short periods of time that the security people are actually interacting with the board. Because the board in general is more interested in the business aspects, and they want to talk about those more, and they end up narrowing down risk aspects and security aspects to much smaller time frames. I generally have accomplished that through using multiple slide decks. So I'll have a slide deck that I actually present to, which is very minimal, very few items, bullet points, almost talking points to keep me on track, and as a point in the brochure that they get of all the stuff they're covering that they know it's security time. And then I'll have a secondary slide deck that has all the information, almost like an appendices that's just handed out to the board members for their ability to peruse whenever they have the time. And that one gets into very specific detail, structured more in a business case mindset and a risk mindset than it is necessarily over the risk sets. So you end up identifying things of what are the biggest threats to the business from a risk standpoint. and then denoting exactly how those are affected with different things that are out there at the time. And just trying to structure everything in that format. Normally, when I started an organization, it takes a good 3 or 4 board meetings before board members really start taking input and really start looking at talking to the security guy more, because they don't have the ability to build trust with you quickly because of those short interactions. And you have to demonstrate that you deserve to be spoken with, that you understand the business aspect, that you're not coming at it from this left field of only technical area that is the mindset that most people in business are in when they think about security people. And then you can start opening up and having more of those honest, direct conversations. Until then, it's a lot of just trying to get the information appropriately in front of them, even if it's for theirs to review later.
Yeah, those are great points. And, you know, I have heard from board members that sometimes CSOs will come into these board meetings and they want to bring everything in the kitchen sink. They want to talk about, you know, all the great things that they're doing in the security program and all the operational outcomes that they're achieving. And, you know, they want to highlight all this. You know, Doug, from your perspective, you know, getting in the nitty gritty, you know, should it be 3 slides? And then, you know, to Rob's point, you have an appendix or you have a separate deck. To Niloof's point, you know, where they want to dive into something specifically, that you can have those informed conversations. But, you know, isn't that the goal, you know, preparing for the 15-minute meeting to establish trust? 3 slides, like Rob said, very minimal bullets. Can we agree that's the optimal strategy?
I would definitely agree with that. I know in preparation for the board meeting, putting together a slide deck and pre-read material for the board is critical so that they can get on the same page and come prepared to that board meeting with questions. The idea of having an appendix with additional data, or if they wish to dive very deep, is also very helpful for the board, so that, as I indicated, when they do show up to that meeting, they can have a very frank, a very clear and pointed conversation with the expert, which is supposedly you, the CISO in that room.
You are the experts. So to add on to that, I want to go back to Niloo. So my thinking on this is, when we talk about risk and we talk about business, you know, strategic business risk, really for the board, it boils down to loss, right? That's what risk is. There's obviously upside risk, and that's a different topic, but generally risk is loss. And there's loss that stems from, you know, reputational risk. There's loss that stems from, you know, the loss of operations. But ultimately, everything can be boiled down to a number. And my supposition is that the board really cares about answering 2 questions, which is, are we going to lose money? And if so, how much? And there's obviously a lot more nuance to it, but at the end of the day, that's really what they care about. So it's not, they don't necessarily want to dig into ransomware or phishing or business email compromise or get into the weeds and all the ways they can lose money. They really want to understand the probability of, are we going to lose money, right? And if so, why? And if so, how much? Is that fair?
So Levi, I would frame it a little bit differently. While of course we care about money loss and damages, what the board really cares about is, and should be concerned about, is shareholder value. And monetary loss is only one input into shareholder value. So if I were to put that in context, JP Morgan had the biggest breach in financial services history, and their stock was up the next day because Jamie Dimon stood up and said, here's what happened, I'm on it, I got it. And they suffered no shareholder value degradation. That's a really good outcome from a very, very bad situation. Similarly, if you look at Target, FedEx, any of the big breaches, within months of each of those breaches, the share price was back up where it needed to be. And if you contrast that with companies that didn't have that experience, it was all about how they managed the breach, how they manage the incident. So the board really has to think about 2 types of risk. There's tangible risk, right? Risk to dollars, risk to operations, risk to systems. But they also, like you said, have to think about intangible risk, which is risk to reputation, to customer loyalty, to trust and confidence. And that tends to have a systemic effect, and it's just a much more long-term effect about it. And you actually think about those two things very differently, right? Tangible risk has to do with the resiliency of your operations, the mitigation, the incident response plans has to do with your security architecture and the capabilities of the team. Whereas intangible risk has to do with transparency, communication, and crisis management. It's about showing leadership and competence in how you manage that breach. And I know we're going to talk about communications later on, but it's conveying that your goals and priorities are aligned with those of your stakeholders, right? Your customers, your partners, your regulators. And if you can do that, then you can, it's sort of, I mean, you think about how much FedEx lost and what happened to their share price, which was a historic high within 6 months of the breach. You can manage your way through that. So that's the nuance I would put on it, is our job is to care about shareholder value and long-term shareholder value creation, not so much in the moment, the cost. I mean, again, we care about the cost of the breach, but we really care about the long-term effect on shareholder value.
That's great. A great point. And I really want to get Doug and Rob, I want to get your perspectives, and Doug, maybe you can go first. But I also want to piggyback onto that question and Nilu's response in terms of when we talk about loss, and Nilu just pointed out, you know, that's part of the equation. Is it important to quantify it, or can we be qualitative about it? You know, I feel very strongly that it's difficult to have these conversations about potential loss without being able to quantify things, without being able to have a formula that is somewhat transparent in terms of the variables and the assumptions that go into how you arrived at certain numbers. And I know in our industry and threat intelligence, especially, a lot of what we do ends up being a color-coded traffic light system, a high, medium, low. And I feel like there's a lot of things that get lost when we try to calculate and communicate risk, and it ends up in these very generic buckets. You know, Rob, you know, do you lose more sleep at night when something moves from amber to red? Like, you know, are you getting more sleep when something moves from medium to low? You know what, it doesn't mean anything, you know, and the way that we communicate it is very vague and general. So I feel very strongly about quantifying risk, but I'd love to get your perspectives on whether it's a worthwhile exercise in terms of having more informed conversations with the board. And that's, you know, sort of the follow-up to what Nilu's talking about. And Doug, maybe you could start.
Sure. You know, when I think about the quantification of risk, I find it in some areas, it may be easier to put a dollar amount against a loss versus other areas. So if you look at an organization from a maturity perspective, there's some organizations that have identified, oh, a customer record is worth X amount of dollars to us, whether that's to gain that customer record and maintain that customer record. We have specific values to these items that could be a part of a breach. And I think a mature organization like that could put a dollar figure against a data breach or a loss. I think other organizations that may not be as mature and haven't put dollar figures upon these very highly sensitive assets of the company may not be able to put a dollar figure against a breach scenario. So I think, again, it really depends upon the board. Does the board want a quantification or a dollar value assigned to what a potential loss would be, or are they okay with, you know, this high, medium, low color coding type of a system? And I think that's a great conversation to have as a CISO with the board.
Rob, what do you think?
So, I mean, to Doug's point, every board is not going to be the same. Every person is not the same. There are trends that you follow, but really you need to get to know the people that are involved, what they want to see, what they like to see, and don't alter things to be what they want to see, but learn the format that they would like to see it in and deliver it to them that way. I tend to do roll-ups of risk under specific silos. So instead of going through individual things, I'll just do this is the overall risk of that particular program. And then I'll include a larger amount of data as to why that risk is there in the handouts. And if someone there wants to dive into it in that meeting, which very rarely happens, but it can happen, I also have the information that I can point to in the spreadsheet, and I can actually have that conversation with them there. The only other point that I would point out, we were talking a little bit about risk and some of the negative opportunities, impact removals that you're looking at when you're communicating with the board. I like to talk a lot about opportunity cost and differentiation as well when I do those communications, because you can use security to differentiate yourself from the market. In some industries better than others, and it's something that's worthwhile to look at doing, and definitely that's a thing that the board is going to want to know, is if there's some way you can use security to differentiate yourself from your competition and potentially give you a leg up, that's the audience that's going to want to know it, as well as the C-level. Or if there's opportunity costs that they could be potentially looking at. So you're not just looking at the potential negatives, you're looking at the loss of the potential positives with some of the things that could be going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point about opportunity cost. We actually have a question from somebody in the audience who said, one of the challenges they've seen in the security world is justifying the cost of doing something to protect the company. In most cases, the work is like insurance, and it's really challenging to attach ROI, or return on investment, when it comes down to the brand image. What would you recommend, or how would you approach this when asking for funding? I guess, that sort of piggybacks onto this topic of, this is the risk, in this area. But if we made a control change, if we spent resources, if we invested in controls to address it, it would change the risk profile, from X to Y. How do you communicate that? How do you communicate what those resource investments are going to return? If you're not doing it in a quantifiable way, how do you do it in a way that the board's comfortable with it? That's for you, Rob.
Oh, I thought I just went and you were going to ask somebody else. I'm sorry.
No.
I adamantly believe that there are two distinct parts to the role of a CISO. And the first is, it's your job to communicate risk in business terms to the leadership of the organization and the board. And that's actually your primary job. Your secondary job is when they've chosen something and they want to do that risk mitigation, you need to effectively manage the cost of it and manage the running of it so that it's as effective as possible. That's the part that most leadership within security gets stuck in, and they don't tend to look at the part where I'm saying is your most important position within that role. That's the position that's going to get your organization moving forward. It's going to remove the roadblocks for your team. It's going to allow you to be successful in what you're doing and not end up just banging your head against the wall constantly because people aren't listening to you. So being able to effectively communicate that risk. Some of it is quantitative and some of it is qualitative. It just depends on what it is, and it depends on what industry you're in. Brand risk, in a lot of ways, is qualitative. You can take swags at it, you can take guesses at it, but all of them are going to have giant asterisks next to them saying this is a guess, and we don't necessarily know what it is. And you're trying to establish with them what all the risks are, this is at the board level, what all the risks are and what their risk appetite is for the company. And ultimately, as long as you've completely illustrated what all those risks are, if they choose to do nothing, that is still a very valid thing to do. And as the CISO, as long as you have adequately and appropriately demonstrated what those risks are for them and they understand them and they make a business decision anyway to move forward without them, you've done your job. It's not your job to eliminate all risk. It's not your job to make sure nothing ever happens to the company. It's your job to make sure that everything is completely understood in the waters that that company is sailing in so that they can make the appropriate business decision to choose what waters to sail through. Completely went across a metaphor there that I hadn't brought up previously, and I apologize for that, but it seemed to flow well.
And Levi, if I can add just one thing real quick, there are exercises that are super helpful for security teams to sort of have insight into the different categories of risk. And then there's, communicating, presenting those frameworks to the board. And those are those can be two very, very different things. And what you definitely don't want to do, especially depending on where the board is on its journey of understanding security, is open up a black hole of, trying to understand how you quantify the risk, getting into the metrics and the assumptions and all that stuff, because that is where the board's going to go, and it's going to start questioning all that stuff. And we know it's not yet precise enough. You don't want to look into the regression analysis against how you quantify the risk. So, but similarly, by the way, we don't do that in the core business either from a board perspective. So I think the frameworks for quantifying risk can be very insightful and directionally correct in terms of understanding the categories of risk and developing insights. Again, whether you're ready to have that be a board level conversation that quantify, the calculations around that is a different question.
So Nilu, when are you comfortable when a risk is presented? When are you comfortable in terms of addressing that risk? What do you like to hear that makes you confident that the risk is being addressed, and how do you measure that?
So the goal is to make sure that, and look, this is one of the things that makes cyber insurance very interesting, right? Like there's no one model for cyber insurance. There's no one costing platform. The actuarial tables are still all over the place, because it's not like flood insurance where you go, hey, there's going to be 100 homes that could get flooded. We know exactly what the sum total of that is. A cyber risk can become, incident can go global, right, and affect your entire business. It can be systemic and affect the entire industry. So it becomes very hard to really quantify it precisely yet. So from my perspective, the question is, do we understand, again, from a tangible perspective and intangible perspective, what we have to protect? Do we have the right programs in place to do that? Are we learning from every incident? Where are we on that journey? And I think that's actually one of the more important themes that Cisos can convey to the board is, security is a journey. There's nirvana. No one is at nirvana. We will never get there. But we're all on a path, and understanding where we are on the path, how we're evolving, and whether we're meeting those goals, so that we can stand up when an incident happens and say, yeah, this was a risk we understood. We have all the plans in place. We're taking care of it. We got this. That's really what matters.
No, that's great. I think to your point, I'm a passionate advocate for quantifying risk, but I also understand that the messaging has to be up-leveled sometimes in a very qualified way before you go to the board, for the reasons you just said, which is once you delve into how you arrive at these numbers, it gets a little bit hairy, quickly, and that's not the point of it. I guess moving on and pivoting from there, Doug specifically, a lot of the CISOs I talk to, I ask them, what is the goal of the security program? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And a lot of times the answer that I hear is, we're trying to increase our maturity around ISO 27002 or the NIST cybersecurity framework. And we're trying to move our maturity, from a 3 to a 5 or whatever it may be. And the issues that I see with this is that, there's obviously a lot of things that you need to do for compliance and governance, obviously. But mapping an entire security program in terms of objectives completed potentially means that you're sort of inviting a check the box mentality, which is to say, the line item in the NIST cybersecurity framework says that, we need to have a 24/7 SOC as an example, but we go staff that 24/7 SOC with people who aren't really capable of doing the job correctly. Or it says that, we need to have, a firewall, right? But, and we don't, we put a firewall in, but we don't tune it correctly. We don't, apply the rule sets correctly. So I don't think that compliance with a framework necessarily equates to reducing risk. And, sometimes it may even lead to wasting resources where you're addressing something in the compliance framework and moving on, but there's still risk that's there. What do you think about that, number one? And number two, what should be the ultimate goal of a security program, and how should a CSO articulate that to the team?
Well, I think everything is based in a framework, but I think you're absolutely correct. If you are completely focused upon a framework and the controls that the framework identifies, and spreading that money across all the framework controls, you probably won't have a very effective security program. You talk about what is the ultimate goal of that program. The program is to manage risk appropriately. So, in looking at that framework or the foundation of your security program, you also need to be informed and getting that information to modify how you're going to apply controls upon that framework is key. So ensuring that you're taking threat intelligence into the equation, you're looking at your existing posture through risk assessments, knowing your environment, as well as knowing just how generally the people within your organization operate and use IT are all different inputs that would be used in filling out the controls of the framework. Again, not putting the controls completely the same across the board, but increasing controls in some areas and decreasing the number of controls in other areas based upon that informed look at the situation.
Yeah, and Rob, to you, there's been many examples over the years of organizations that have experienced breach events that were just certified compliant, whether it was the PCI data security standard, whatever it may have been. And my other issue with the compliance frameworks is that they don't update frequently enough. So, they may update every year or every other year, but the speed at which threats move and evolve, the compliance frameworks don't necessarily keep up. Are compliance frameworks nice tools in the tool bag, or should the security program be holistically aligned to them?
So frameworks are different when you start talking about different industries. When I was in defense and aerospace, there are so many frameworks that you have to deal with that you have a full-time job just dealing with the frameworks that are associated between all the different government agencies and what's required in order to subcontract. Frameworks, for the most part, are table stakes because of those industries. That's your starting point. That's your floor. That's where everyone that's going to be doing business in that area is at or should be at. And at that point, you start talking about the risks associated with being there and where you may want to go in order to mitigate risk higher than that. That's where the differentiation and the opportunity costs and those kinds of things start coming into play for how you might want to make yourself stand out from the rest of the pack, where your framework is the level that the entire pack is supposed to be at. They may not necessarily be there, but that's where they're supposed to be. It also gets different when you start talking about different areas of frameworks. I went through a breach at one of my past organizations. Even though we were PCI compliant, we still had a major credit card incident happen. We had passed PCI compliance with no changes 3 years in a row for the particular thing that had a problem. And as soon as we breached, PCI came back and then stated we were not PCI compliant, even though we had received it. And that is very common for that particular industry. They're always going to fall back on that particular thing. And they're going to do it via the ambiguity that's within that particular kind of framework. So the framework is ambiguous enough that you could do something that an auditor will say will meet it. But then on a second look later on, if you come from it at a litigatory standpoint, they'll say, well, that's not what was meant by it. This is what was meant by it. Therefore, you didn't meet the framework. Therefore, you may have passed, but really you weren't meeting the actual framework itself and you were out of compliance. That's a very regular thing that happens. And that's part of why compliance is a completely separate organization from security. It really should be a completely separate organization from security. The CISO in general is in charge of both, but it's like a VP of operations being in charge of two completely separate products at the company. Yes, he's in charge of both, but they're both completely independent from each other. They really should not have any tie-ins to each other, other than your compliance people will be doing some auditing type functions on your security people to meet their frameworks.
No, that's great insight. Nilu, taking that point that Rob just made about reporting, I recently read a report somewhere that said looking at enterprises, publicly traded companies, the CISO tends to still report to the CIO, but in private companies, they're not publicly traded. A lot of that is changing, and the CISO, the CSO is now reporting to a chief risk officer or even a chief financial officer. In your opinion, in a perfect world, where should the CISO or the CSO ideally be reporting to?
Look, I don't think there is one answer to that, and I think it's different by industry. It's different. If you're highly regulated, depends on what your risk profile is. I do think there has to be one person who has their neck on the line for security, whoever that person happens to be, whether that's the CIO, the CRO, the Ciso themselves. So I don't think there's one perfect structure for any organization, but the accountability has to be there at the CXO level, because that's what this is. This is a executive level issue. It's a board level issue that we need to care about. And I've seen it work in multiple ways. Financial services, it works one way. Aerospace defense might work a different way. Tech company, it will work a completely different way, right? In some tech companies now, especially the big tech platforms, you have the CISO reporting to the trust and privacy officer. So it's I think very dependent, and I don't believe there's ever one org chart that works across the board for every company. I do think you have to be very purposeful about how you develop that org chart, and it shouldn't be driven by personality. It should be driven by the outcomes that you're going for. Mm-hmm.
Doug, do you have any issues with the CSO reporting to the CIO?
That's actually how I'm currently reporting. So there's always always concerned that if I'm pulling up a vulnerability report which demonstrates that let's say patching wasn't very good, that may reflect badly upon that operations role. So it's not the best type of reporting structure, you might say, because there is a potential conflict of interest when that individual reports up the chain.
So I want to pivot into threat intelligence a little bit. Obviously, Recorded Future is a security intelligence company. And, I, of course, see it as very integral to a security strategy. But I'd really like to get perspectives from all three of you on how important is threat intelligence when determining risk? From my perspective, it's obviously very important. I have a vested interest in it, in understanding, both what adversaries are doing and how their tactics are evolving, but also internal security controls. And, you can't really understand, from my perspective, where you have gaps in your internal security controls if you don't really understand how adversary tools and tactics and techniques are evolving. But I'd really like to get all three of you, your opinions on this, specifically the role that threat intelligence can play or should play, or maybe not at all.
As a Recorded Future board member, let me start and talk about the incredible value of threat intelligence. No, look, historically, as security professionals, we were very focused inside our networks, trying to understand what was going on, trying to understand our systems, et cetera. But the reality of the world that we live in today is that we have to have that outside in perspective, and we've got to be able to marry that with the inside out perspective. And that's actually the growth that the industry needs to go through. So from my perspective, and this is it hardly ever rises actually to a board level conversation, but threat intel has value left of boom, during boom, right of boom, right? You need to have insight to understand what the threats against you are so that you can integrate it into your security products and make it actionable. And I think, by the way, threat intel reports are great, but the holy grail is having it integrated into your security products so that it can get automated and it can actually be actionable real time. Of course, during an incident, investigating the incident, understanding the techniques, et cetera, the actors that were behind it, it's incredibly valuable. And then, post-incident, minimizing the impact, understanding third-party risk, right? And where that comes from, and making sure that the safeguards that are in place that you learn from through the incident are actually working, becomes super important. So I think across the board, threat intelligence is important. it becomes critical if it's integrated into your security architecture. I think having printed reports that folks have to go through manually is valuable, but clearly not. So that evolution of the industry of getting that integrated is super important. I'm a little bit biased.
As am I. Rob, what do you think?
I don't use them at all. No, I'm just kidding. I think they have their place. They're one tool that, if anything, they're used to focus some of the tools that you have. I think there's other things that you can use potentially to fulfill the same function. It also depends pretty heavily on your industry and what you do in your industry. So for something like, say, a government sector industry, it's going to be significantly more important to know what your threats are doing out there, how they're doing them differently, if China's bugging you today, or what China's thinking of trying to do, and having insight into that is very, very important, just because of the amount and the complexity of the attacks that are going on against the service of that kind of organization. While at the same time, if you are Johnny's Garage Service, who has 12 locations across the United States, it might not be nearly as important for you to know that, because you don't necessarily have as many adversaries. If anything, you're going to get caught in drive-bys more than you are in targeted shootings. Okay, that went into a dark metaphor quick there. I apologize on that one.
Don't go to negative town on me. Come on, Rob. Let's stay positive.
They do have their place, and in different industries, they have a different level of stress and importance, is basically the general answer.
Doug, any disagreement?
No disagreement, complete agreement. I think that threat intel helps to provide you the insight as to what's occurring at what you need to be concerned about at your organization. So traditionally, prior to threat intel, you would be reliant upon your more reactive sources of alerts. Oh, we're seeing X quantity of this flowing through the firewalls, or we had this amount of blocked things occurring, or we saw a signature of this on the IDS. When it comes to threat intel, I think it allows you to look beyond the horizon and utilize some of that intelligence to proactively look at items in your network. So use some of these indicators of compromise, use these hashes to proactively search within your organization for threat actors and tactics, procedures of these bad guys, if you will.
So just to finish up here, Doug, there's obviously a lot of room for improvement in a lot of different areas, and we've touched on a couple of those here. To just wrap up, what's one thing that we're doing well as a security industry? And I'd love to hear from everyone your thoughts on, one thing that we're doing well.
So I would say evolving. We're evolving well. The industry is generally going in the direction it needs to. It started in its infancy very similar to the same way that the CIO type role started in its infancy, and really needed to work its way out as it grows. And it is going in the right direction. It's evolving the way it needs to.
I think as more and more organizations are more focused on information security, we're going to see a greater adoption of the ISACs, or the information sharing groups. That is a very positive trend, greater communication among us, potential victims, to prevent the bad guys. So I think that level of information sharing is very important, as well as threat intel.
Yeah, and I would agree with both Rob and Doug. To echo what Rob said, the security function was a very technical function a decade or so ago, much like the finance function was, much like the CIO function was, and it is evolving into a strategic function, and we're seeing that evolution. And folks like Rob and Doug are very clear examples of it, and that's incredibly important. And the second piece is the collaboration and information sharing. I would absolutely agree that the real sort of partnerships that are happening. And, we've also talked about public-private partnerships for a really long time. They're starting, and the ISACs are a great example of it. They're starting to bear fruit and come together and be effective, not just to protect organizations, but to protect systemic risk, which is what I think we should all be concerned about. So I do think, it's a journey for everyone, including the industry, and we are moving up the learning curve fast, and that's good to see. And we're working together well, and my dog agrees.
Yeah, just in time for some positivity. It's great. So that wraps up the session that we had today. We have 2 questions left. So the first one, isn't the goal of cybersecurity to minimize the frequency of incidents and its impact? Nilu, what do you think? What is the goal of cybersecurity?
The goal of cybersecurity is resiliency of an organization. So you want to make sure that as things happen, and look, it's, we all say this, we have to be right every single time in our security posture. And as long as we're humans, that's just not going to, this stuff is going to happen. And hopefully humanity will be around for a long time and we will have these issues, but the goal is really resiliency. And part of that resiliency is to reduce the impact of each incident that does happen, and to evolve our organizations and work together to minimize the impact. Frequency, sure, but you could have 1,000 low-grade incidents, and it doesn't really matter much, and that one existential thing hits you, and that matters a lot. So I worry more about impact and resiliency than I do about the number of incidents.
That's great. The follow-up question, Rob, maybe you can take this one. How does threat intelligence collected somewhere else matter, or how is it relevant to my environment? Especially when there's a lot of data overlap between intelligence vendors?
As far as the overlap is concerned, there's many vendors out there for doing it. It depends on what industry you're in, how important the intelligence feeds are to you. If you're a international government subcontracting agency, you probably are going to get multiple feeds. And yes, there will be overlap, but you're accepting the risk of that overlap or the cost of that overlap in order to try to better ensure that you don't miss anything. And you took the question away. I couldn't read the first part of it. Okay, re-answer it. Intelligence that collected somewhere else matters in and of the fact of if they're reporting that intelligence on an adversary that is coming after what your organization is doing. So let's say that you're in retail and there's threat intelligence that's gathered on Middle Eastern crime syndicates that are targeting retail organizations to try to steal credit cards. That's relevant for you to know how they're doing it because you're in a retail industry. Patterns of that nature are how it falls out to be relevant.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob. And thanks everyone. Thank you to Doug and Rob and Nilu. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jason.
Thank you all very much. Extremely insightful discussion. Very important topic, which we could spend all day talking about, really. So to get as much as we did within the time allotted was an absolutely fantastic job. So thank you to all of our panelists today and to Levi for moderating the discussion. Thank you to all of our attendees for staying so attentive, and thank you very much for your contributions through the Q&A feature. Until the next sync and recorded webinar, please obviously stay tuned for further information. If anyone has any information or any questions for any of our panelists as well, or any questions for the folks at Recorded Future, please do feel free to reach out. I'm sure Levi and even Nilu would be open to having a conversation with you guys. But until next time, everybody at home, please continue to stay safe, stay secure, and we will see you at another webinar sometime soon. Thank you.